The catalytic event that started Newsreel was the 1967 March on Washington, in which a group of many different filmmakers were working on, or just documenting this event. Out of this meeting of like some 50 filmmakers came Newsreel.
But Kartemquin began with 3 guys out of the University of Chicago. It was 1966. We were excited by cinema verite, and we thought if you reflected society back on itself, that would be enough to make social change. So a few years later, we were beginning to understand that reflecting society back on itself was not enough.
An aspect of this which is very important and probably a little difficult to understand now is that when these films were made, or Newsreel films were made, we didn't have a distribution network in order to be able to get these films out. You know?
There was no distribution network in this time. If people were going to see our movies, we had to create that situation. And we thought that we were going to make these films and we would be on TV. And none of our early films were ever broadcast, except recently. Now that we're history, as we re-release our old work, we go to the local public television station here and they're like, oh yeah, sure, we'd be glad to show that. And it's like, gee, that wasn't what you said 40 years ago.
I mean, people understood not only that we were making films about them, but we were making films that would be accessible to them. And this was like an important part of the equation. We weren't making films that we would leave the community and we would leave the place where we were working. The films, the work that we had done in filming came back in terms of something that people could use to facilitate the organizing activity that they were engaged in. So many people, they never saw films about the Black Panthers on television, but they saw films about the Black Panthers by people who were Black Panthers, who went into different communities to show their film.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, coming from a different place, that's where we were evolving to. Realizing that, you know, as the collective formed and as people came around, we began to be very kind of conscious of what we were trying to do. I think we shared a sense that, you know, as we got into what we call the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, we had this sense that the world was about to change. We really thought that we were changing things. We thought that the struggle against the maternity center, that began when Sue Davenport and Jenny Ward came to me and Jerry at Kartemquin, and they said, we'd like some help with this film. And that was really the genesis of the collective. And they were making film to be used in that struggle to win the struggle. And this happened to us a couple times. As we worked on the film, and we made some, you know, we would go and show it, we'd take the work print and we'd put something together and we'd show the film at meetings and stuff like that. But what we began to see is, not only weren't we going to have, the struggle was going to be lost, and we weren't even going to have the film done by the time it was lost. And so that pushed us to kind of step back and say people who are engaged in these kinds of struggles need to have an understanding of what they're up against and what the underlying analysis is.
But another question that interests me, and it's relevant both to the present day and to this period of the 60s, 70s, was, you know, there was a real sense not only of the relationship between generations of activists, but of the connections between activists in far-flung parts of the world. Am I right in thinking that there was a great sense of the connectedness between experiences in, you know, Paris, London, New York, Chicago, Santiago, Mexico City, Tokyo? Was that something that was important at the time to the disposition of filmmakers?
It was essential. Newsreel was invited to go to Vietnam during the height of the Vietnam War to interview Ho Chi Minh, and this was like part of this kind of a network of filmmakers, political activists, and so forth around the world who were like sharing films, in a way that I mean, we can share films now on YouTube, on Vimeo, and all kinds of other electronic digital devices. But to share films is like transporting something which is physical, you know, across borders. In order for us to get the films in from Vietnam, we had to make a deal with CBS to smuggle the films in. Otherwise, we would never have been able to get the films in. I mean, you look at how films are moved around now, it's a completely different world.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing. And Hoop Dreams was a real turning point for us. Because with Hoop Dreams, what we saw was that by returning to some of our roots in a more pure kind of storytelling kind of film, we had the potential to draw people in who were not even sympathetic to the people in our films, and to maybe open up their minds.
If you could just talk a bit about how your ideas of documentary compare, how you thought about documentary when you started, and how you saw your work in terms of those traditions, and how you've changed, how you see documentary now, and how your work is different as a result.
Well, the irony, of course, is that I don't think of myself as a documentary filmmaker. So I came out of a particular historical moment, the 70s, which is feminism and the second wave women's movement, but also experimental film is where I started. And that intersected with what was happening with film theory and criticism in the 70s. And there was this particularly vibrant community, I would say international community. You know, there were publications like Jump Cut and Camera Obscura. There were people like Ruby, Julia Lesage, Chuck Linehands, Linda Williams, Judith May. I mean, I'm missing a lot of people here, but there were distributors like Iris Films, Women Make Movies in its initial iteration, where they were teaching women how to make films, and in its current iteration, which is distribution. So even though I wasn't part of the collective, I was an individual person, there was this whole community, and there was this conversation that was taking place, and it was taking place between filmmakers as well as film theorists and political people. And so when I thought of you know, we constantly talked and shared ideas and politics, and we were really close to our audience, and it was what Gordon and Allan were talking about. You physically took the film, showed it to an audience, and got feedback, and you were physically part of the community. So I always thought of myself as creating films that were connected to lived experience, both historically, politically, socially, psychologically. And I did a tremendous amount of research, almost journalistic, in creating the films, but I never thought of them as documentary, and I was deliberately trying to critique documentary, particularly with Daughter Right and What You Take for Granted. I'm doing the same thing now. Although the work I'm doing now is interactive and on the web, and I think after Steve talks, maybe I'll show a clip. Good.
It was really interesting listening to Allan and Gordon talk, because it got me thinking about my own path, which was very different than theirs. I fell in love with movies at a certain point. Now, I've been studying journalism. I've been kind of on a track to go into radio, because the school I was at in Virginia had an NPR station, and I worked there, and I liked it, and I thought, well, this could be kind of fun to work at in national public radio kind of setting. I kind of fell for documentary as a way of sort of blending my interest in movies and my former interest in journalism. But I didn't fall for documentaries as polemics or political action. I wasn't a political person. My politics were, I think, pretty liberal and still remain so, but I didn't come at film, I didn't have these rousing issues I wanted to address in that way at all. I was still very much interested in just trying to tell a good story, or a story that resonated for me. And so what was interesting to me about the reason I wanted to tell the story of Hoop Dreams was in part because I had grown up playing basketball. I'd had African-American teammates who I played with for years, but never really got to know in any kind of deeply personal way. And I think, some of this I only figured out later, but I think part of the impetus when I do the film was to try to understand what that game meant to them and why it was so much more important to them in a broader sense than it was to me, as much as I loved it. And it was not that we were unaware of the social impact or the larger forces at work in telling that story, but wasn't my way into it. And so I think what I've discovered about my work over the years is that I get attracted to stories first, interesting people in interesting situations or at interesting crossroads. And I'm fascinated with that, and then it's almost then I kind of realize maybe the story has something larger to say. So it's always approaching from a personal and then seeing large implications. And I think you asked what have we learned over the years. I, like Michelle, in many ways, am still doing the same kinds of films that I did with starting out. I think, if anything, I've come to appreciate a desire to try and make these films about people in ways that really are complicated in their portrayal, that give the audience some room to have their own views of who these people are that are being profiled in the film, and to constantly try to work against the audience sitting in judgment of people, because I think it's the easiest thing to do is to sit in the dark and look at the screen and make judgments.
I think actually both of you have made work that's focused on really compelling characters. That you both really ground the work that you're doing in people and in the characterizations of people. And I know you both have clips here to show, and it interests me that you're both now moving toward work on the internet. Because I like to say to students when I'm talking about these earlier histories, like those we just saw, I like to tell them, well, 16 millimeter was the internet of that time. And so it's amusing to me that you're both making that jump. And I want to see some of this work, and then I want to get you to talk about what it means to think through community when you're talking about an internet platform.
So Mixed Screens has 8 stories. You can read the description up there. 4 generations of my family, 4 generations of lesbians. The lesbian stories are fiction, but they were based on many, many interviews that I did. And I'm going to show 4 little clips. It's a do-it-yourself movie.
I know we're going to see some clips from you, Steve, but first I just have to ask, Michelle, so how did you come to have these photos? I mean, it's just such a disturbing and fascinating example of living in isolation where there used to be community, and living in a city that isn't sustaining them anymore. And
right.
Just how did they come into your possession?
So there are 3 characters. There's Norma, Virginia, and there's Kevin, who lived across the alley from them. And he befriended them and was their only contact with the world. And when Norma died when she was 80, Virginia died a year later, and they had no family, they had no friends, and they left their house and everything in it to Kevin. And so he was a possessor of these photographs, and when I was making Mixed Greens and was doing all these interviews, I met him and have these photographs. You know.
Part of the reason that I asked is that there's a short documentary that's been shown on the festival circuit called A Story for the Maudlins. I don't know if anyone's seen it, by a Brazilian filmmaker who lives in Madrid named Sergio Oksana, and it's about a family that's reconstructed in a documentary because of all the photos that was found out on the sidewalk after they died and there was no ear.
So is it fiction, or does he?
All of the photographs and paintings and videotapes are real, and the story is semi-researched, semi-fictional.
Okay, so I have to say the story is actually documentary. I mean, I did all of this research for this story, so that's true. Yeah, I
It's interesting to see those at the same time. Yeah, it's just fascinating.
What I've gotten involved with coming out of this film, The Interrupters, that we did at Kartemquin, is a really ambitious website that grew out of the film. That I think clearly the most, by far the most ambitious outreach component on the web that we've done yet. And it's interesting because Allan and Gordon were talking about activism in film, and as I said a little while ago, I didn't think of myself in that way and not as an activist. And I don't think of the films that I've done as being activists. But I do see outreach differently. I think one of the ways in which Kartemquin has evolved as an institution over the years is that the activism was far more prevalent in the work at one time, and the work itself has changed and become less overtly activist, but Kartemquin has at the same time become very, very committed to outreach for the film, so that the films are more than just provocative entertainment, that they actually can and will be used in ways by people who are activists or in different settings to try to make change. The Interrupters is a film about urban violence. It's set here in Chicago. It follows this organization called Ceasefire, and in particular these three, what they're called violence interrupters. They're people from the communities who are ex-gang bangers, drug dealers, convicts, who now work to try to quell violence and turn people in the neighborhoods away from violence, in some of the very same neighborhoods that they were once part of the problem. And so, in the film, we follow them around for a year, and in a sort of very gritty way, you sort of see this work that they do and some of the successes they have and some of the difficulties in succeeding. In the film, we filmed a lot of shrines, and so, those shrines that pop up in places where people are murdered and killed, and they're usually there for a fleeting amount of time, and then the cops take them away. And so we came up with this idea, initially of what if we did shrines and try to create the shrine experience online, so that people could build shrines to people that they've lost, or in the case of actual shrines in the real world, they might document them and then post them, and they would live in posterity. And the idea here is that we would try to figure out a way to draw people who are really impacted by this violence to have a need fulfilled by going to this website. I think one of the things that is exciting to me about the web as it relates to an existing film is that you can find different ways for the film to live and work for people, and be a tool for people. That it won't necessarily be as a film experience for people. And then I think as we go along, I think one of the things that's going to happen at Kartemquin, just like it's happening everywhere, and Michelle's doing it, is really conceiving projects that are really for the web. In the case of The Interrupters, I don't think I've been associated with a film, and I won't speak for Kartemquin as a whole unless you think it's fair to say this, Gordon, but that has had such an incredible outreach to every kind of organization, from prisons to lawyers groups to police departments to schools to you name it. People have reached out to us wanting the film, and it's even had an impact measurable impact of, it helped the city of Chicago decide to give money to this organization, $1 million that they had never given before, and it's brought this program to other cities. So the film operated on that level. When we went to do the website, though, I think our really core audience, the audience we were really wanting to reach, are people who are really affected by violence. That's the audience we wanted this to reach, which is not to say that we don't want other kinds of audiences to find this appealing, but that was the core audience, and of course, along with that, the people that could get this to them. So teachers, because the reality is that most young people who are, period, but certainly around this issue, are not going to go out and seek out this site. It has to be brought to them. It has to be made aware. They have to be made aware of it and see the value in it. And I think that's the big hurdle in anything in the internet. It's one of the things that I've noticed is that here in the States, in the documentary community, that everyone's chasing how can we make websites impactful, powerfully impactful. And it is a challenge because of the fragmented culture that we live in.
When you say people are trying to make them impactful, is that because they want the work to have an impact, or because they have to do that for funding reasons?
Well, I think it's both. I think first of all, a lot of funding is going towards the web. Like for instance, on the interrupters, we were able to raise considerably more money for the web than we were for what I would call boots on the ground outreach. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing, but I think that people are seeing the web as some kind of profound way to reach people, and I hope it's true because people are spending a lot of money on it. Well, I think one of the challenges is that we all know about the impact that the web can have. We've seen it in other countries, especially where a video gets posted that causes profound activism and change. It's not the reason it happened. It couldn't just happen in a vacuum, but it's the thing that touches it off, right? That's a lot harder, I think, to do here. And I think it's part of what makes this a bigger challenge here. I like to think about, when Rodney King happened back in '91, what if the web had been up like we have it now? The impact, that had a fairly significant impact as a single incident, but that was the kind of image that had a kind of power to it.
We've used the web over the years. I never had a lot to do with it. And now I'm actually doing a project that begins on the web. And it's something that I shot back in 1963 with Jerry Temner. We were still students at the University of Chicago. And there was the huge Chicago school boycott. We had a racist school superintendent. He put trailers behind the black schools to deal with overcrowding rather than integrate some of the schools. And other than the little, I spliced some of it together at the time, and I would take it around to meetings, and it was being used by the groups who were involved in the boycott movement. But other than that, it was never shown. It was never, I offered it to Eisner Prize over the years, and no one ever, this particular piece of history was a little backwater. And so what I'm going to do, and we're actually launching it, with any luck, in April. And it's a very low rent project. I've got, there's some people here who are working on it with me, and someone's, a very young person is designing the website. And we've taken 500 stills from the footage. Anytime there's a recognizable person, we're posting it as a still. And we're basically working with alumni associations, with other partner organizations to try to get the word out. And one of our interns, Rachel, already found one of the guys who's in our footage, the sync footage. I have some sync footage of the kids on the march. And I want to find these people from, almost 50 years ago. And hear their stories, hear their lives. Sort of here they were, kids who stood up and walked out of school and, created this huge demonstration in Chicago, and now to sort of make a short film. But the real idea of the project is that then the website will become a place for them to reconnect with each other, to post what memorabilia they have, and to create, and I haven't quite started this part yet, but I want to create the ability for them to then go into the Chicago public schools today and engage with the people who are struggling about what's happening in the schools today. Because the issues, and it runs through all of our films, the issues don't change.
I want to add something that's kind of related, but it's about Kartemquin, because I came after all this, right? But when I came out of graduate school, you know, I've been in a grad school program, I got an MFA, and so we did a lot of, I got into film production, but, you know, I had to read my share of film theory and criticism. Maybe not my share, but I'm looking at you. But, you know, there was a lot, at the time I was in graduate school, you know, a lot of the theory and stuff we were reading had to do with structuralism and Marxist feminist cinema theory and Lacan and semiotics. And here I was, a film production student, and when I was in grad school, I had this notion, this idea of doing the film that would become, you know, Hoop Dreams. And I didn't feel like it was an idea I could even share with people when I was in school, because there was a strong feeling running through the theory criticism and through the department about who should tell certain stories. And I was not the person that should tell that story of African American young hopeful basketball players in Chicago, a city I'd never even been to, really. So, but when I moved to Chicago and I came to Kartemquin and talked to Gordon about it, it never came up that I can recall. I mean, it's not that you weren't sensitive to it, but it wasn't, I never felt.
Remember what I asked you though, in some kind of way, and I'm pretty sure I did ask this. I didn't ask it.
No, it never came up in as you didn't think about it.
No, but I think because it relates to the question that was asked earlier, which is, I think the question that's important is, it's not who gets to tell whose story, but we're approached a lot by people who want to do a film about homelessness or inner city basketball. And you have to ask the question, what gives you the right to make that film? And you had an answer. And that's, maybe I didn't verbally ask the question,
right,
but you had an answer. You talked about your involvement with basketball, all of you did,
right,
you know. And so what I saw from that is you had a common ground with these people you wanted to make a film about. And that was the key. It wasn't that you were, you know, looking at them from, oh, they're a problem,
right,
or they're this, or they're that. You had the right approach to it. But I think that's a critical question that everyone should ask themselves. What gives you the right? Doesn't mean don't make it, it means have the answer to the question.
But I was going to say, I think one of the real threats now, though, is a loss of community around filmmaking. Because when I first got to Kartemquin, you couldn't go make a film unless you knew somebody with a decent camera, and because not everybody had a camera that, you know, could shoot unless you had $40,000 to spend on a state-of-the-art camera. You couldn't just edit at home on your laptop. You couldn't make these things by yourself, and nowadays you can. And I think that's great in one way, it's empowering in a way, but it's also, I think, a problem, because I think it can turn filmmaking into a lonely occupation as a creators. And I think one of the great things, one of the great virtues of organizations, and mine is with Kartemquin, is that if there is a community of filmmakers there that can help inform the work you do, make the work you do better, challenge you in ways, you know, I'm working with this young filmmaker now who's making this film completely on their own, and she's really got something, but she doesn't have the skills of the community that could have made, you know, really could make it a much better film.